Okay, everyone, you're most welcome again today to this, the 10th of a series of 10 webinars that the Humanitarian Leadership Academy has been rolling out. And we shall have more webinars. I'll talk about that a little bit later towards the end of the session, but it's not the end. It's the beginning of a new season, actually. And this is going to be a really, really interesting webinar for us to close off this series with. And just a couple of reminders, this meeting has been set in webinar mode, so you will not be able to speak, but you will be able to send comments on the chat box and also to write questions on the Q&A. So we're going to start off now, though I can see there are many people joining, and we are hoping to have at least 100 people on the call. We have about 31 at the moment. So the title for our webinar today is how to make sure online learning is inclusive for all. Very interesting and relevant topic for us, and we look forward to learning more. Melanie, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. Wonderful. So we have got a guest speaker here who some of you may remember from our 4th webinar within this series, and this is Melanie Worrell, who is the Director of Educational Technology Consulting at Inclusiv Education. Melanie is based in Adelaide, and we're really excited to have her on the webinar just now. Melanie, do you want to say anything? Maybe you can turn on your video before we start, just to say hello.
I will, Sheila, I'll say hello after you finish doing all of your introductions. Hello.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Melanie. And my name is Sheila Waruhiu. I'm the Talent Management and Capacity Building Manager for Save the Children International. So before we start the webinar, I just wanted to remind you a couple of things around this presentation. Melanie, if you don't mind highlighting those on the slide. The following slide. Wonderful. So as I mentioned, you can use the chat box to communicate, and I had asked for people who were joining a bit earlier to just say their names and their title. It's a good way for you to get to know everybody else who's on the call. And as we move along, you could also type in your official questions for Melanie in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll be raising the questions on that box as well. A reminder that this session is recorded, and the recording will be available to you on the Kaya website where you registered, and you'll be able to listen to that later. We encourage active listening as we go along. I know it's tempting to look at your phone or to answer an email here and there as we move along, but for you to get the real benefit of this webinar, it's important that you follow with us, and I'm sure it will not be difficult because it's an interesting topic. At the end, remember, you can claim your badge. Many of you, I think, know the process of how to do that on the Kaya website. All you need to do is fill in a small reflective document. I encourage you to make it as comprehensive as possible. Highlight for us what your key takeaways are from the webinar, and maybe some actions that you intend to take forward as the result of a webinar. This information is really important for us. It also gives us ideas on the kind of areas that you might be interested in reviewing as we move forward on the webinar series. We've also put in our Twitter handle in there. So we encourage you also to keep up on social media. So that is all for now. I'm going to keep a look at the chat and the Q&A so that we ensure we answer questions, and there will be an interactive session. So questions will be answered as we move along, but at the end, we also have a specific time for answering questions. So feel free to engage. Thank you so much. I'm handing over now to Melanie, who will take us through the session.
Hi, everyone. I always like to say hello like this before we start a session, because when you put presentations like this together, you get to choose the best picture of yourself to put in there. So I just like to show you my face so you can see that I'm a real person. Sheila, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. As Sheila said, so my name is Melanie Worrell and I work for an organisation called Inclusiv Education, which is pretty fantastic that I get to do workshops like this and around what is inclusive education, or how to make online learning inclusive for all. So I'm going to get started by just I'm going to get started by telling you, yes, Sheila said it's 6:30 on a Friday night for me here in Adelaide in South Australia. So I just wanted to let you know that if I kind of forget where I'm going, that's because it's 6:30 on a Friday night and it's been a long week. As Sheila said, I welcome you to put your comments in the text chat. As we go through this, there's a couple of places that I'm asking I'm calling for comments, I'm calling for your feedback, I'm interested in what your experience is. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at what is online accessibility. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does inclusive mean, what is this, we've got some specific terms around online materials, online content, online tools. We're going to look at some considerations for making content accessible. So what are some of those things? And I've actually got some hints and tips, not hints and tips, I've actually got some very specific things that I can show you that I've done wrong in this PowerPoint presentation to illustrate accessibility. Then we're going to look at where to find information and supports. I'm going to give you a bonus 5 hints and topics around making content accessible. So if everybody's happy with that, that's the way we're going to spend our next kind of 45 or 50 minutes of time. So I encourage you, please use the text chat. Tell me what you're thinking. Ask me questions. I'll stop my talking at any stage to make sure that that's responded to. And most of all, share your experiences. We really look forward to sharing your experiences and your challenges, because this topic that we're doing today actually came from the previous topic that I did around how to develop online content. We had so many people asking about how do you make it inclusive, how do you make it accessible, that we actually used that feedback to do this one. Okay, so we get started. If we were in a face-to-face room, we'd be able to see each other and we'll be able to talk about where we come from. So Sheila, can I have a poll question? I've got 3 poll questions to get us started.
Sure. So
now the first question, fabulous. So the first question is, where are you? Where in the world are you? I know that some of you have already started putting it into the text chat, and this is just a really funky way of us getting a nice little snapshot graphic. So I'm going to give you another maybe 10 seconds or so. These are really quick snap polls. As soon as we start stopping getting the comments through, then we stop.
Yep, we are on 80%.
I reckon that's good.
Yep, so I'm going to end polling now and then see what that looks like.
Look at that. Oh, aren't I naughty? I didn't put down where I was from. And I can tell that because we don't have anybody from Australia there. So most people in Asia, we've got nearly equal amount in Africa and Europe. So welcome. All right, so now we go to the next poll. So the next poll is, what is your role in the sector?
Okay. Let's see what's happening here. Sorry, is it the same one that's showing up?
It looks like it's the same poll.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me pull the second one. There you go.
Fabulous. So what is your role in the sector? And some of these titles aren't exactly necessarily roles, but we're interested in, are you in education? Are you in vocational education, university, HR, media and comms? Where are you? What do you do? In the last session, I think the majority of people were in, I think the majority of people were in some form of education in the last presentation. So let's have a look.
Okay,
And
I think
yeah,
I'm going
stop
to,
it now, I reckon.
yeah, I think I'm pulling now, and let's have a look at that. We have some comments in the chat box as well.
Excellent. Training and facilitation. Check that out. So let's have a look. We've got training and facilitation, the most of us. We've got some in technical. Hello to the technical people. Very nice to have you along. A few people in media and comms. Oh, we've got a lot of others there. So please feel free to pop your you know, what you do in the other section. I was quite intrigued to see that we have somebody from a, now I have to flick through and find it. Sign language.
Yeah, we've got an adult learner for child protection and humanitarian action.
Fantastic, excellent. All right, so we've got one more poll for you, and that is, this last one is about what you know around inclusive education or accessibility. What do you know about it, and you know, sort of where you're up to? Because what this poll does is it gives me the opportunity to tailor the presentation a little bit. If everybody came in and said, I've got it under control, I just want hints and tips, then I would most certainly change the presentation slightly. So we've got majority of people sitting, we know a little bit, know a fair amount. Oh, somebody knows a lot. The people who have put that you know a lot, then we will be really looking forward to your contribution. Don't know where to start? That I will give you a couple of links to help you where to start. So I reckon that's probably a great looking poll there. So we've got, I know a little bit, but not much seems to be the most common place that we're at. And we've followed closely by I know a fair amount. So that's fabulous. Okay. So because we've got so many people here that know a fair amount, do you know when I might just get rid of that poll now. Is that okay, Sheila?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Has it disappeared?
Now it's gone. Okay.
All right.
I've given presentations similar to this in the past, and to you know, to teachers and trainers and practitioners in Australia, and I can't tell you how often I've got to really sort of you know, have a lot of context around why accessibility and inclusive education is important. And a lot of, you know, a lot of people sort of know it in their gut, but I've only been working in the development space for a very short period of time. By short period of time, I mean since February. And what I found very quickly about working in the development space is that when we think about cross-cutting issues, inclusive education is a serious, you know, it's right up there with gender in terms of cross-cutting issues. So one of the things that I often challenge people to do, and it's difficult to do it because we've only got 45 minutes now and there's a lot of stuff to go through. But what I challenge you one day is when you're on your computer or your phone or whatever device you use, I challenge you to turn the display off. I got a new phone about 6 months ago, and as you do when you've got a new technology, I was not able to sleep, and so I was being very naughty. I was laying in bed, and I clicked on an accessibility tool, and I probably shouldn't have been doing it laying in bed in the middle of the night anyway, but my screen went blank. And so I'm stuck in the dark with my new phone with a blank screen, and it kept on talking to me. Press, 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 off, off. screen, screen, screen. And I was literally stuck. I had no idea what to do because I'm so used to being able to see everything that's around me. And so one of the things that I often challenge people to do is just to see what it's like to not be able to see. Try and turn your monitor off and see how you go. See what happens on your organisation website if you have to navigate using screen readers and tabs. So one of the things that, one of the things I think it would be really great to start with is, what is inclusive education, or what is accessibility? What does it mean for you? So while I'm talking away, I welcome your commentary and your comments within the text chat, because one of the things that's a little bit interesting here is sometimes we use the word inclusive, and sometimes I'll use the word accessibility. So I just want to, kind of just for clarity, is that inclusive education is obviously about more than just stuff that's online. It's about more than just your online courses or your learning management systems or your learning platforms, or, it's more than just those tools that you use. But the wording accessibility has a very specific meaning when it comes to online. And it's not just education, it's all types of online. So when I use the phrase accessibility, I'm not talking about, obviously we need to think about the platform. We need to think about the way people access their devices. But accessibility is a very specific word that we think about when it comes to online and digital content. So oftentimes when people talk about content being accessible, it means that you can access it. And I hear that a lot. I hear people talking about, we need to make our content so that it can be accessed. Accessibility is actually a little bit more than just that. So I'm just looking at the text chart. So we've got accessibility being about physical and technical access, internet connections, the ability to see and click on buttons. But inclusivity is more about including the different groups who might struggle to engage. So Stephanie, that point, I think that's a really good delineation between accessibility and inclusive. So we've got the quality of being able to be reached or entered. Accessibility is about availability in terms of content, process and methodology. So and we've got accessibility means to be able to access something. So accessibility is the word being able to access learning through acceptable and relatable means. It means to the extent that we can reach a content or thing, which is a very precise and interesting definition. So when we're thinking about an inclusive program, we're often thinking about everything in that program and how that's inclusive. When we think about accessibility, when we think about online content, we talk about this phrase accessibility, and we've got a common language that we can start to talk about what that means across platforms. So it broadly means making web content more accessible for people with disabilities. So one of the things that's very interesting about the word accessibility is that we have a set of standards called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they give us a set of standards around how we can make our online content accessible. And I'm going to take you through that in a second, but what the guidelines do is they make no difference between permanent or temporal disabilities. So I often find in my nice, warm home, when I'm talking to teachers in Australia and say, you need to make your content accessible, they say, but I don't have people who are blind, hearing, or insert disability here, so therefore I don't need to worry about this. And my response is always, and I've got a comment here in sign language, it's all about the visual than the audio. Thank you, that's wonderful. So disability can be a temporal thing. So for example, if we all fell over tomorrow and broke our wrist on our dominant hand, our ability to be able to access, do our work, type on a keyboard is going to be incredibly impacted. So accessibility isn't just about how we make content accessible for our learners. It's also about how content is accessible for all of us as a community. It's about the way we work, it's about our internets, it's about our intranets, it's about how we share information across our organisation, as well as the programs that we run and the learners that benefit from it. So I'm going to take you through kind of 4 areas. So who has difficulties in hearing or seeing what's on the screen? So either yourself or people around you or your students or the people that you work with. What are your experiences of having difficulties in hearing or seeing what's on the screen?
Please feel free to put your comments in the chat and we'll be able to read them.
We've already had Sungi start to put comments in around sign language being more about visuals than audio. So as you pop through these, okay, so Stephanie's popped in there, I wear glasses and often have to peer closely if the text is too small. Poor eyesight, language accents, blurred images, complicated visuals. Let me show you a couple of things here. So we can make it easier for people who are having difficulties with hearing or seeing what's on the screen, or perceiving what's on the screen, if that's a better word for it. Just put that in the text chat. Perceiving what's on the screen. What some people do is what you've got in order for your users to be able to perceive what's on the screen is they can use things like screen readers. So most websites and most devices and tablets have a built-in screen reader these days. A few years ago, you would have to download a specific screen reader, but there's a lot of free options out there. And what the screen reader does is it literally starts here at the beginning, and it will read everything that's on the screen for you. Okay. So another option that we've already had mentioned in the chat about visuals as opposed to audio is, what if you're using a screen reader? How does the screen reader know what this here is, this icon, this logo? How does the screen reader know what that is? Well, the screen reader, we can program alt tags into our courses or our PowerPoints. We can include alt tags, which means that when the screen reader goes, reads that, reads that, reads that, and comes down and reads that graphic, it will actually have a description for the screen reader to read. What about media? So if we're thinking about videos, for example, what if I can hear the video but I can't see the video? What if I can see the video but I can't hear the video? So when we're thinking about online content, something like media with captions, and oftentimes what we see is we see closed captions. A really interesting one that, just having a look, sometimes the videos and audios are too quiet even if the speakers are at max volume. Yes. So if you're, if you're not able to hear it, if you're not able to hear it, if the volume can't be turned up, those sorts of things, having a synchronized text written track to an audio track can be really important. But then some people don't want to listen, they want to be able to read. So at its heart, accessibility is about giving people options on how they access the content. So And Sungi said, and good point, most deaf people cannot read English or any other spoken language, hence an interpreter becomes the best option. And that's, that's a really, really great point in terms of how do we think about how our content, our online content is going to be consumed. So I just want to pick up on this concept of non-text cues. So when we say non-text cues, I've got two examples here. All right. So oftentimes when it comes to online content, and whether we build it ourselves or whether somebody builds it for us, or we're using an app or a product that's been prepared, we have control over some of the language that we use. So accessibility doesn't necessarily have to be about technical fixes and how do you technically do something. It can also be about how we describe things. So this first example, select the button to show how you feel. If you were colorblind, you wouldn't be able to see the red and the yellow and the green. The concept of red and yellow and green is a traffic light concept, and it implies that your learner or your user recognizes that red is bad and that green is good. So we've got a cultural component, we've got a sighted component, we've got an unclear instruction. So compare that to the second example. Select the button to show how you feel, color, graphic, and then text. Select this if you have no idea. Select this if you aren't sure. Select this if you're uncomfortable. So oftentimes simple language around non-text cues. And oftentimes I go onto websites and I say, I see things that are implying that I'm a sighted person, and they're implying that I understand what the nuance or what the non-text cue is. I've got in the text chat as well, language, accents, and complicated visuals. Absolutely. Complicated visuals can be, complicated visuals are an example of a non-text cue. Something that I see a huge amount, and this is as much about what we do in PowerPoints for ourselves and our people at work as much as I see it in online learning materials and apps and products and websites, is just around color contrast. So I don't really need to ask because I think I know the answer to this, but of those examples, which one is the easiest to read and which one is the hardest to read? Well, the hardest to read is the yellow on white, the white text on yellow. And what this is about the contrast of the two colours that are together. And often colour contrast is something that we can control and we can test ourselves. So to check the colour contrast, what you need to be able to do is locate the colour code. So every colour has its own code. You locate the colour code and you put the values into the contrast checker. So I'm going to show you one that I use, but I'm not, I'm in no means saying that this is the best one. There's probably hundreds and hundreds of easier ones. So let me just go back here. So we said the second from the top is easy to read. So that second one there, the white on the blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this color contrast checker. And what it does, just as a coincidence, you can see what I've got is here. The background color is white, and it doesn't matter the difference between the background and the foreground color. Okay, so we can see that it gives us a pass, that it's got a good contrast ratio, and it's a pass from the WCAG standards. So if I was, for example, to randomly put in a background, so well, this isn't random, put in black. So that color blue is fine in terms of contrast on a white background, but it's not okay on a black background. What I actually do oftentimes when I'm choosing colours, when I'm developing online content, is I come into this tool and I make a decision about whether those two colours have got enough contrast to be able to include in the content. And I can't tell you, it's not a written down hint or tip, but if any of you are ever working with a graphic designer, I strongly encourage you to double check their work, because the majority of graphic designers I've ever worked with will not do colour checks on their work. Okay. Something about perceivable is also when you find things in the usual places. So I'm just going to go back to my colour checker. What we generally find on websites is that in the top left, there's either a logo or a menu. In the top right, there's often a logo and a menu. When we start to get online content where the developer has wanted to be cool, or they wanted to sort of use different strategies to engage learners, and they just think that it would be cool to have a menu somewhere else, that can be a really simple way of making the online content so it's not accessible. Just put stuff where it normally goes. It's a simple type of a thing. So the second big thing that we often find is about understanding. So this is about difficulties understanding a site. So for example, I go to a website or I go to a tool and I click on a button or I select a button, and what happens? I can't download it. It's a file that my computer or my phone or my tablet or my device doesn't understand. So when it comes to understanding, a big thing is there's an old file format called Flash. They're known as SWIF or FLA files. Browsers aren't going to accept those files anymore. So if you're using an old online course, a course that's, it could literally be only a couple of years old, if it's been built in the language of Flash, one day soon it's just going to stop working, which is a huge problem. It's a huge problem. It's not a problem about people with disabilities or not abilities. It's just a file problem. This is the thing with a lot of the work around accessibility is it's not actually about making things accessible for this person with this disability. It's actually just making the content accessible for everyone, or the tablet or the app or the device or the product we've got. So common tools and file formats, Flash being, an old standard that's not used anymore. But oftentimes language is a problem as well. And we've already had in the text chat, difficulties with language accents and complicated visuals. So what about using the various technologies? What about difficulties in using your keyboard or mouse? So what we need to be able to have is with our devices, with the tablets and software, we need to be able to make sure that people can use or operate, that they can operate the site. So as an example here, if you've never tried this before, I challenge you to do it because it's an interesting thing. Go to a website and just try and navigate without your mouse and just use the tab key. It's a really fascinating thing, and you should be able to see on the screen how I'm using the tab key to jump around. So tab 1, tab 2, tab 3, tab 4. Hang on a second. If I was using my tabbing key and tabbing around, and I was using that in conjunction with a screen reader, what's going to happen here? My screen reader is going to read that there's an image there, then that content, and then the heading, and then that logo. So this here is a problem, because what I want the user to do is I want the user to read the heading first and the content second, and yet the way my presentation is laid out, If somebody was using a screen reader, they're actually going to read the content first before they get the heading. So in terms of working with your technical folk or evaluating products and services that you're using in your programs, having the ability to be able to tab through your content or use a screen reader is going to be critical to making your content accessible. A second thing around difficulties around using keyboards and mouse and those sorts of things is that concept of the timeout. And I often see in education, in education you often see things like, you have a half an hour to do this test, or time is used as a gamification feature, so do this really fast. And that's that's a cool strategy, and it's an engaging strategy, especially for, people who are really competitive and want to get in there. It's a great engagement strategy. But if you don't have a corresponding strategy for people who are using different technologies, perhaps screen readers or tabs and those sorts of things, then they're going to be disengaged in that learning process because they're not able to access it the way that you imagine the other users can. And oftentimes game developers or developers who are focused on kind of developing engaging content, which is great. I'm kind of one of those people, so I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but they need to be aware of how they're developing content to make sure it takes these things into account. So I actually realised that I missed one. There's 4 and I only had 3 in the slides. Oh, where is my proofreading when I need it? These 4 things, being perceivable, being operable, being understandable, and being robust. So the robust was the bit that I missed, sorry. These are the 4 principles that make online content accessible. That it needs to be perceivable. Your users need to be able to perceive the content, the interface, the navigation. It needs to be operable. They need to be able to operate the website or the product. It needs to be understandable. They need to be able to understand whether that's the text on the screen, that it's written in a simple way, or whether that's, understandable in terms of the file formats, so that, the learning management system that you're using is using files that your computer can understand. And robust means that users can use a range of devices or assistive technologies to access that content. So those 4 principles. So I'm going to take you through just a really brief example of picking apart the trap, okay? Some of the things that we need to keep in mind. So alt tags. I mentioned screen readers before. All right. So let's I'll put my screen there. What happens when I'm tabbing around? Okay. So again, I'm starting there. Oh, this one's in a nice order. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here, I'm here. Okay, so I hope everybody can see that. So if I had a screen reader, what would happen is as I tab along, the screen reader would say Alt plus tags. Tab again, the screen reader would say the previous version is an example of what not to do. The text is in the graphic and the graphic has no Alt tag. Right click on the image to check. So just in the text chat, how many people when they're putting images into Word documents or into PowerPoints, or if you develop online content, how many of you are using and checking that you're including alt tags with your images? So never, not yet. I know that you know, because we can see your names with the chat. Does anybody do it? So we've got, you can. Daniel, you can, but do you? Only started doing it a few months ago doing the website. Ezra, I'm going to tell you where it is in a second. Elena, you're developing a MOOC. Good for you. Alt tags. Fantastic. Elena, are you also using all of the web accessibility guidelines? I'll ask you that question later on. I'm going to ask you to remember that question so you can answer it later on. Yes, so we've got a couple. Okay, so what I'm going to do to add the alt tag here, I'm going to right click on the image to check it. When I get into that image, when I get that menu item, I can see the word alt text. So I go in here. The alt text is accessed by screen readers for people who might have trouble seeing your content. So my title is POUR diagram. Now, I'm going to be super sneaky here because I've actually got the graphic where I've actually got the text from that graphic somewhere else. So while you guys are listening to me babble, I'm copying and pasting my text into it. Bang. So now when we have a screen reader access this particular thing and it hits the alt tag, it will be able to see the text, accessible, perceivable, So I can hear you asking, what about this graphic here? This graphic here is just a decorative graphic. I don't want my screen reader to read it. Well, if you, click the wrong button, sorry. If you don't want a screen reader to read it, you can just put a double, I call them dits, I'm sorry, there's probably a more correct word for it, your double quote marks. Put a double quote mark in there, and what that means is the screen reader acknowledges that it's not blank because it's empty, it's blank because it's decorative. This beautiful little piece of orange, I almost said greenery because it's a Friday night. This beautiful piece of orange bar there is really just something to make it pretty. And so we don't need a screen reader to read that. All right, so I can hear you saying to me, Mel, you've only just finished talking to us about people who might have difficulties using a keyboard or mouse, and you've just used the text right click. In the text chat again, if you please, who uses the phrase click in your writing, in your PowerPoints, in your online courses, in your MOOCs, in your, how many times have you seen the word click online? It's one of the first things whenever I start working with a new developer is always going to, a new developer is always going to put the word click in. What happens? What happens if you're not using a clickable device? What happens if you're using a phone or a tablet? What happens if you're a keyboard user? We don't click if you're these people. So why are we using the word click, which is basically restricting your audience to people who are using mouses? So let's take into account everybody, not just mouse users. Let's say the word select. Now, I can hear you thinking, Mel, you're showing me a PowerPoint slide. What is this font here that you're using? Is the font that you're using legible? I often work with graphic designers and they say, oh, these fonts, they're beautiful. And I look at it and say, you know what, that might be beautiful to your eyes, but it's not legible. You can't read it. You can't understand it. So we can do things that are, some people see them as being graphic choices, when in actual fact, it's about making the content so it's not, inclusive for all of our users. So, so there you go. All right. So that's lots of, I know, get to this point, we've got 15 minutes left. We could probably do days and days and days on accessibility. I hope you find it as interesting as I find it incredibly interesting. So this is the part that I'm going to show you some, where do you actually go? All right. So I pop that link there into the text chat for you. Okay, so we have international standards around making online content accessible. We've got international standards on these. They're called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And what they do is and I'm just going to scroll down super quickly. They started out WCAG 2, so that's the acronym for it, WCAG. They started at 2.0 and now they've recently done an update up to 2.1. And what it does is it's a whole set of resources that help us make sure our online content is accessible. So the first thing that I always do when I'm developing online content myself is I set myself up a style guide or a template, a set of checklists to make sure that I'm meeting it. If I'm hiring a content developer, I'll say, hey, are you familiar with WCAG? I need to talk to you about, how we make our content accessible. If I'm working with a graphic designer, I'll say, hey, tell me what you know about accessibility, because even though you're just doing colors and pretty stuff, you still need to know how to make that accessible. So it doesn't matter whether you're working with content developers or software developers or app developers or graphic designers, or you're developing the content yourself, you're developing a MOOC. Eleanor is, following some of the accessibility guidelines in the MOOC that she's developing. But what happens if the MOOC platform that you're putting the MOOC on isn't accessible? Well, there's not much that you can do about that, but what you can do is tell your learners what to do if they are having a problem. So I'm going to wind that back a second. So what the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so what the guidelines do is they give us 4 things. They give us the principles. Okay, so we already know the principles because that's what we've been talking about this evening. That's about being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, the 4 principles of accessibilities. They give us guidelines. So the guidelines say this is the basic goal that you should be working towards. They give us success criteria, and then they give us a whole heap of techniques to say, hey, if you want to meet this criteria, then this is what you can do. Somebody's just put, it's more about accessibility than decoration. And oftentimes, graphic designers do a really brilliant job at making things look really great. But again, it's got to look really great for everybody. I talked to a graphic designer once who didn't even know, and we may not know this, but it should be a graphic designer's job to know. There are websites out there that emulate different types of colour blindness. So if we know that red-green colour blindness is one of the most common forms of colour blindness for young men, you can actually go to a site, see what that looks like, and then get the graphic designer to do the colours for those learners. Okay, so where are we here? All right, so I'm going to show you an example here. Now, again, let me just scroll down. Okay, so in terms of being perceivable, the first guideline is that you need to provide text alternatives, right? Which is just simply saying that you need to provide text alternatives for any non-text content. So colours, videos, audio, just need to make sure that you've got a text version of that. So what could that look like? That might look like if you've got a control or an input or a button, that you don't just have a button with an arrow on it, you've got a button with an arrow that says next. If you're using time-based media, okay, so time-based media being video or audio, that you can have text which is synchronized with the time-based media or not synchronized. So closed captions or a text alternative. As you can see, I'll just go down. So we've got the sensory testing experience, sensory capture, decoration, and visibility. So what we've got is a guideline. We've got the success criteria, and then we've got additional notes on, on how to meet that success criteria. So if we have a look at time-based media, all of a sudden what that we have is we have a level A, a level AA, and we have a level AAA. So what this means, and this is very relevant for the conversation that we've been having with Sungi, is that there are 3 levels to meet. Now, a lot of countries set a level of AA as a requirement. So for example, in Australia here, anything that we develop should be meeting AA, but it's like A is the easiest to meet. AA, like A, you should be able to meet just by doing good practices. AA is good practices and a little bit more. And if you're meeting the AAA, you're meeting it to the AAA standard, then there's a little bit more involved in that. So for example, Tsungi made the point around people who are deaf might not be able to sort of read. That could be a challenge. So they actually need to have the sign language signed for them. So we can see we've got a success criterion, which is about providing a pre-recorded sign language that can be provided in synchronized media. Okay. We're getting close to the end. We're getting close to the end. This PowerPoint that you guys will all have access to, so has got some screen grabs in it. They're not alt tagged screen grabs. I hope you forgive me on that. So we've got time to answer the questions that are coming through, and we've got time for questions. Here are my bonus tips. Okay, so my bonus tips are: spend some time having a look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They are incredibly easy to read and understand, even if you're not a technical person. I'm assuming that there is a translated option. I'm going to look at that in a second, but one of the things that people often find is, are the guidelines written for really hardcore technical people? No, they're not. They're written for technical people, for graphic designers. You can use them in many, many ways to guide you in your work. So when you're thinking about accessibility, you can start with really simple things like adding alt tags to your images, using styles so that the decoration on the text is different to the content in the text. Check your color contrast. Add text alternatives to your scripted videos. I often find, like, people often say to me, I don't need to script my video. I can just look in the camera and talk for 5 minutes. And I say to them, but if you've got a scripted video, you don't have to transcribe your text alternative and write your closed captions. And then finally, my tip is to develop your own style guide, regardless of where you're going to be, which parts of this you're using. If you have a style guide, it gives you a checklist of the things that you're looking for, whether you're looking for them yourself, your developers, your designers, your graphic designers, your content developers, or your software developers, your technical people. And really importantly, just start a conversation and a dialogue in your organisation about how you are, as an organisation, meeting accessibility requirements. So this might be manager type people, it might be technical people. If there can be sort of many people across the organisation that can help you with it. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking for a second. Excuse me, I'm going to stop talking for a second, and I'm going to just flick back through the questions. Pardon me. Does anybody have any questions? Please pop them in the text chat. There is one Q&A. Okay. So someone has asked in the question section, can I get a detailed guideline? I am going to, as a follow-up, just bear with me while I write a note for myself. As a follow-up, I'm going to give a really high-level guideline that you can start to use for your checklist. So Eleanor, you've asked as well if there's some sort of a checklist. I've got one that I use for myself. I'm not going to say it's the most beautiful example of a checklist. And I use it particularly for online learning content. But I would be very happy to share that with you as a part of the, we'll have that as a part of the materials. Sheila, is that okay?
Yep, that's absolutely fine. I was just going to say we can post that together with the recording for this webinar. So
absolutely.
As soon as I get that, I will be able to post that. There's another question in the chat around language, accessibility issues involving language barriers.
Stephanie, that is, I am going to have to answer that, not necessarily offline. I'm going to have to answer that because there are some specific guidelines within the accessibility guidelines around accessibility when it comes to language. So I can't answer that off the top of my head, but I will come back to you. I'll pass that information through Sheila and the resources here, because the reason why I'm also hesitating to answer immediately is that it goes beyond just adding a Google Translate to a website, for example, because then we've got complexities of left-right language, right-left language, those sorts of things. Just as an example of how one rapid e-learning tool, there's a rapid e-learning tool that actually lets you extract out all of the content into like a Word document so that you can do a translation and then upload it. So yeah, I'm sorry that I can't exactly answer that question, but I hope you've got patience with me to kind of at least be able to come back and give you some places to go and look. Okay, so some pictures presented in presentations may be interpreted according to the listener and the one that are presenting. How do we do this? So yeah, look, Mustafa, I think that we have I think we've got a responsibility to write very cleanly and plainly around the text that we use, and to describe the pictures that we're using and why we're using those pictures in a particular way. Because what I think that what you're getting at is the understanding. So, for example, how might different people understand what that picture is trying to mean? And I'm a words person first. So even when I'm presenting something graphically, I tend to have a description in words on what that might be. And so what that means is, because I've got the words and then the picture with the words, I could do an audio recording of my words to assist with that. So, Mustafa, I'm not entirely sure whether I've answered the question the way that you were expecting, and if not, just let Sheila or myself know and I'll do my best to answer that offline. The checklist, off the top of my head, because I've got about 3 checklists that I've used in the past, and so I'm stuttering over my words because I'm not entirely sure which checklist I can provide, which is more about who I made it for and whether I made it for a client and whether there's IP involved in that sort of thing. But if worse comes to worse, I'll send you through a checklist. Okay, so just looking in the text chat. Thanks, very good. Greg, tips on how to provide content for those with poor internet connections. Literally describing my last 4 weeks of product development with the inclusive learning platform that we've been working on. That's a really big question. I'm sorry, I can't answer it at the moment in the short span that we've got. But Greg, I'll put my email address in the chat, and I'm happy to talk to you about that offline. On that note, by the way, I'm on LinkedIn. You're very welcome to look me up and become friends with me on LinkedIn. Okay. On
that, Melanie, maybe I could just add one of the solutions that the Humanitarian Leadership Academy is looking at for that is text messages. But we'll see. I mean, it's a project that we're just starting off, and we'll see how that goes. And I'm hoping we can feature it at some point in future. In one way or
and
the
it's kind of that thing around poor internet or intermittent internet. There's, you know, like the Save the Children movement is using a lot of IRI, interactive radio, as a way of kind of just like literally getting around poor internet access. There are, you know, there's a range of strategies that involve like really technical things, or just like choosing other ways of distributing content. So it's a really big thing. Rana, yes, I believe that Sheila can share the link, everything here, the recording and whatnot.
Yeah, that
Sheila
will be
can tell
available on the website. As after
I've
this,
got one.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go on.
I've got one more question to answer, just because I know that we're really close to the end of time.
Yeah.
What's the recommended font for people with low vision? Oftentimes what we do is with online content recommend a sans serif font. And what I mean by that, I will just, I can't even spell, sorry. Sorry about that. Let me just do a quick web search to show you. So a sans serif font is the font that it doesn't have the taggy bits on it, so that's probably a good graphic there. So a serif font has these things, and a sans serif font doesn't have those serifs on it, so tends to be the font that's best to be used in an online environment. I'm not aware of a specific font for people with low visions, but there are a couple of fonts that have been built for the dyslexic fonts, dyslexia fonts. So they've actually been built. Research shows that people with dyslexia have a better chance of reading. They have less problems with reading this font. So I welcome you to have a look at that. Okay, thank you so much for having me on a Friday night. It's my Friday night, it's probably your Friday anything. Anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it. I really appreciate the text chats and the various conversations that we have. I welcome to extend the conversations that we're having, and I'm going to throw to Sheila. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melanie. This has been a hugely informative webinar. I think a lot of people have echoed the same in the chat box. I personally have learned quite a bit. I was not even aware of simple things like the website you've just shown to test contrast of color. And this is something definitely to put into place moving forward. Thanks once again, Melanie. And we hope to have you back again looking at some of these issues in a little bit more detail. Wishing you all a good weekend. Remember to interact with us on LinkedIn, on our website, on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you, and we will be announcing the details of our next set of webinars, which should start very shortly. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.